Hey everyone, have you been having a good conference? No? Well, you will do now. You all seem so excited after the food. I don't know if it's you're looking forward to the beer or you just had too much food and feeling sleepy now. So I'm going to talk about offline tracking with the Universal Tracker. A little bit about me. I'm Kamruz Jaman, the British Cam, also known as the real Cam. I don't know if fake Cam made it in or not. MVP since 2013, and my business partner is actually Sura, and he has been very busy working on this presentation as well.
Hi, my name is Akshay Sura. I am a partner at Kamruz Consulting. I've been working exclusively with Sitecore for the past 12 years. I'm honored to be a 6-time Sitecore MVP. Thank you so much for attending the conference. Thank you to Sitecore, the sponsors, and the organizers for putting this event together. I hope you guys have a lot of fun and learn a lot of things. Have a wonderful day.
So actually I had to make a virtual appearance due to being one of the organizers, but he put a lot of time into it, so we thought we'd have him appear somehow. So what are we trying to achieve? Essentially, it's collecting data. I'm not going to do a big Steve Ballmer speech for you on stage, but as one of the organizers of the SUGCON conferences, various ones, Europe and India, so actually I also organized one in North America. What we wanted to do was just be able to provide a better conference experience, better than last year and better than the year before. And as we all know, these conferences have been getting bigger and bigger and better every year. So what we wanted to do is know the conference demographics, the people that are attending the conference, what they're attending, the types of sessions they're attending, and the types of groupings of sessions that they're attending. This would allow us to better cater for the needs in the future. With, for example, Symposium, they do scan you as you come in individually, but with SUGCON, we don't usually have that. As you can see, this year it's printed badges anyway. So what we need, of course, is data. And with that data, we can then gather a whole bunch of analytics, which we can then use to make some decisions on and provide some make some choices for the future to provide a better conference experience. But why? Well, we all love conferences. We all get very, very excited by conferences, especially SUGCON. In fact, you might recognize this place. I hope you recognize this place. You're here right now. You can go next. So why do we attend? Well, we tend to gather a whole bunch of knowledge. We come to attend great sessions, providing to give us more meaningful insights into the things that we are using, how we can use them differently, new features, or even old features that we may not have been using entirely to its entirety. And we come and we listen and we try to, and maybe we play around with some cool gadgets. Maybe we get shot at. But we also come to network. I think that's probably one of the key things that we attend the user group conferences for, particularly, and the symposiums. I know keep meeting a lot of people that I have met online, talked to online, on Twitter and Slack and everything else. We also come to meet some of the superstars of Sitecore and keep them sweet to give us an MVP for next year. But we also come to socialize with each other. And we come to take a lot of selfies. And we come to drink a lot of beer. And a lot of beer. And sometimes a little bit too much beer. Sometimes we need to have a little Sitecore pillow for a little nap as well. And of course, more selfies at all the different events and meeting all our old colleagues. And sometimes we take a road trip with some good friends. We get a bit of food to eat, and we also get a bit of inspiration for our next book. Too much PowerPoint. So at the conferences, the first thing you would normally do is to attend and to gather some swag and some lanyards. So we come and we pick up our ID cards at the desk, if they can find it, that is. We wait for a little while, and once we've got our ID cards, in previous years they've been the plastic types of cards, and particularly with Symposium, you notice that they will scan your cards. So if you noticed on your lanyards, most of you should have a plastic card on there with some sort of animal on there, right? So initially what we wanted to do is we'd have a card and we'd have some details on there, like if it's an MVP, what country they'd come from, if it's a client, an agency, and that kind of stuff. So give us some better insights into who that person is. Unfortunately, due to GDPR reasons, the lawyers said that this probably is not a good idea. And we're still in the EU, so, you know, these rules still apply. And I know most of you would have just been like, yeah, whatever. But, so what we decided to do instead is we just have a card. The card has an ID, and it has an animal assigned to it. So we have 4 groups. We have a unicorn, a hedgehog, an elephant, and a Kamruz horse, which, well, the first 3, of course, are community-sponsored animals. So what we wanted to do is, throughout the sessions, we would essentially just track where people are going, what they're attending, especially with the multiple tracks. You'd be able to then see the types of tracks that people are more interested in, whether it's marketing, tech, commerce, or one of the whatever the other ones are. So the conference itself. So what happens is we turn up and we start to walk, and we walk a bit more, and we walk a bit more. And then we realize that the sessions are starting, so we start to panic and run. And we keep running a bit more, hoping we can find the session we need to attend. Unless, of course, you were at Symposium last year. In which case, the experience was something very much different. That some of us resorted to stealing the local transportation, and by the end of it, it was a little bit painful when we just made our way over to the sessions however the hell we could. And then, of course, you turn up to a session and you're hoping that you can actually get in because, you know, it's not too full, which Symposium, some of them were very, very popular sessions. And they lock the doors, and at that point you're wishing you had some sort of magic door just to run in. So what we wanted to do was have a bunch of scanners across each of the doors for each of the rooms. So we'd place some scanners above the doors, around the doors, and then as people were walking in, it would just scan them as they were coming through. So the cards you have are actually RFID cards, and they are high-frequency RFID cards, as in they can be scanned from a long distance. So most of the RFID tech that people are using are probably NFC, near-field communication technology. So things like the Oyster card in the UK that you've probably been using for travel, or the contactless on your credit cards, for example. These are all near-field technology stuff. So you need to actually be physically very close to the reader in order for the card to be scanned. These, so what we did is we bought a couple of scanners. We wanted a lot more scanners for all of the rooms, but then we found out how much they cost. And so we scaled back to 2, which was still, fairly expensive, but at least it gives us the data and the proof of concept for the proof of concept. So if you may have noticed as you're coming in through this room, there were 2 scanners on 2 tripods on either side of the doors, and essentially these were just scanning the cards as you guys were coming in. You didn't need to touch them or anything. It's just it will read from a distance of 5 or 6 meters with this particular scanner and reader. So what we wanted to do was, for our talk, we had a rough idea of, we wanted to scan people as they came into the rooms. We wanted to push it into the IoT, Azure IoT hub. We could have pushed it into some sort of storage queue, Azure storage queue, or one of their, some other type of service bus, basically just to allow us to capture this at a higher rate than having to worry about hardware and that kind of stuff. We knew that we'd then need something, some sort of app to push that on to something else. We didn't know what that something else was at the moment, and that would then essentially end up into Sitecore itself. So a little bit of a history with Sitecore's analytics. I don't know how long you guys have been around. I see some older faces in here that I've worked with for several years. So back in Sitecore 6.2, Sitecore released Online Marketing Suite, or OMS. This was just around the time that actually I started working with Sitecore, just under 10 years ago. And that collected some basic analytics, right? So very basic web statistics, so what pages people had been viewing and that kind of stuff. And then in 7.4, they released the Digital Marketing Suite, which I found out was actually called DMS 2.0, although there was no DMS 1.0, so they playing with their numbering again. But this 6.4 also introduced the page editor. So that's when the analytics actually started to become a bit more useful, and you could actually start to do things like personalization with the analytics that you were collecting, and that also allowed you to do other things like fire off goals and page events and that kind of stuff. And then in Sitecore 7.5, they released XDB, which was their big data collection, and we moved over to MongoDB for the collection. But we don't really talk about 7.5, so I guess we'd say it was 8 that was actually released. And then in 9.0, they rewrote everything again. And they introduced xConnect, which essentially sits as a layer between the actual storage mechanism, and it in theory can collect data from multiple points. We also moved back to SQL Server, or allowed us to move back to SQL Server with a provider. And back in 2016 in Symposium, I think it was, Todd Mitchell gave a talk on xConnect and the vision of xConnect, and the data collection from multiple points, big data collection from lots of different devices, online, offline, point of sale, whatever. And he was talking about the experience that people had coming to the conference. So a lot of us would have taken a plane, some of us would have taken a train, some of us would have taken other forms of public transport, then we would have checked into the hotel. And then some people would have done some sightseeing, and he was then talking about maybe rented a bike. And the vision was that at all of these points we could be collecting data on you, essentially, right? And using that, adding that into your profile, and then at a later date when you come back to the SUGCON site, for example, we could then deliver a more personalized experience. I'm not sure if he was more interested in the tracking or if he just lost his bike in Copenhagen and just needed to figure out where he'd left it again. So the way we envisaged the interactions working in the conference was you'd have an interaction per day, and then on each day we'd fire off a bunch of events. So you attended the keynote, you attended this session, you attended another session, and we'd fire off a bunch of these using our scanners. So then we started to look into the Universal Tracker, which was released in Sitecore 9.1 just a few months ago. It's very, very new. And the Universal Tracker vision essentially is to provide a headless experience for tracking. So it's to provide you endpoints to track anything, whether that's from mobile devices, IoT devices, virtual assistants, websites, anything. I mean, our scanners essentially are one of these devices that could be talking into the Universal Tracker endpoint. And the vision is to have a collection endpoint, so you could collect whatever data you want, and this isn't available yet, but at a future date would be to allow personalization of your content and personalization via this same endpoint. It wouldn't be exactly via this endpoint because this is obviously an analytics endpoint, but it would allow you to have some data back. So if you're using some other offline devices, you could get that data back. So think of the JSS story, for example, and that has the GraphQL endpoint. So if you wanted to have some personalized data back via that, you could your mobile app could be passing data into the Universal Tracker, and then in a future release, when they have this other API available, you would you could use a GraphQL in your mobile app, for example, to collect data from those endpoints, and then it would be personalized. Nice. There is a Xamarin SDK available, which hooks up a lot of this. So if you want to use that as a starting point, you can. It's actually quite a nice SDK. But it's very simple API endpoints, so you can also just do it yourself. Now you're probably thinking this actually just sounds like xConnect. I can just throw a bunch of data at xConnect, right? Well, it's not quite true. xConnect is only designed for immutable history. It's usually doing things in historically, so you've done a bunch of stuff on your website, and it will then fire off and aggregate that at some future date, whatever your settings are at the end of the session. xConnect is also designed for trusted communication only. So when you set up your Sitecore instance, for example, that you need the thumbprint of your xConnect instance. So if you wanted to communicate to xConnect via mobile devices, then all those mobile devices or the apps on those mobile devices are going to have to know the thumbprint of your xConnect instance. So for security, it's probably not the best thing. xConnect is also a bit of a pain to scale. It will require a lot more scaling because of the processing that it needs to actually do as well. So like I mentioned, xConnect is storing interactions that have already happened. It's based on the end of your session. But Universal Tracker is actually storing events and interactions live. So as soon as you're throwing the data at it, it's storing. Universal Tracker is storing that data, and you can forcefully close a session in order to have that process a little bit faster than waiting for sessions to finish and for interactions to be closed. So the Universal Tracker is built on Sitecore host. There's been a couple of sessions on Sitecore host yesterday. Hope you guys attended that. So this is just another extension point. So this is another example of Sitecore building an extension using their own pluggable architecture. It's designed for headless, so you can use the SDK, Xamarin SDK for for your mobile applitions, but you can just as easily use JavaScript to call the endpoints. There's nothing too fancy going on. It's just accepting a bunch of JSON data in a specific format. There are 3 parts to the Universal Tracker. There's the Universal Tracker collection, which is essentially just a RESTful web API built on .NET Core, and that's just collecting your interactions and any events and any data that you're throwing at it. There is also the SQL Server element and for the storage, and essentially it's working as a temporary storage. They could have used a service bus. I don't know why they didn't. I guess for simplification, at least you can. At least it's very simple to set up, right? You can just put it on your SQL Server with the rest of your Sitecore databases. And then there's the processing element of this, and these are all. So these are both the collection and the processing are separate services, which allows them to scale better. You can run them as Windows services, or just hook them up in IIS, or just hook them up in IIS. Again, it's a .NET Core-based application.
Universal Tracker scaling. So Universal Tracker comes with 3 different components. One is a collection service, which accepts all the user requests in a JSON format, stores it in a SQL Server database, which is a temporary cache, which then gets picked up by the processing service, which pulls all the interactions and events and processes them, either enriches the data or filters it out before pushing it to xConnect. Now, if your application needs a lot of information to be submitted from a lot of devices out there, so your collection service really needs to scale out. You can easily scale it out because these are all .NET Core services, so they're very easy to deploy, so you can easily scale the collection service if you're accepting a ton of information. So say for instance, maybe you're accepting the information, but you are doing a lot of churning of information, looking up data, enriching the data by adding, geolocation, you're looking up people's information, things of that sort. You might need to beef up your processing service, so you can scale up your processing service as well. You could scale up both ends, just so that you are collecting as well as processing at a bigger scale. You could even compartmentalize it, so you could defer it by channel. So for instance, you're getting all your requests from a point of sale system. You could set up a different channel for that. It sends it to a different endpoint. At the end of the day, it comes back to the same xConnect and XDB anyways. So you could segregate it by channel and point all the traffic to one of the endpoints. So you could truly scale UT whichever way you like. It's truly scalable. We have not seen any issues. So I hope you guys have a lot of fun playing around with the Universal Tracker and testing it out.
So yeah, as you can see, it's very, very flexible in its deployment model, and you can scale this based on your requirements, whether you get a lot of high traffic or whether you need more power for the processing. And during the processing phase, we go through a bunch of pipelines because, of course, it's Sitecore, and we couldn't not have some pipelines. There's a pre-filter, enrichment, and post-filter pipelines. The pre-filter you can use just to essentially discard some information, if some interactions, if you don't want to proceed with that. Enrichment phase, you can start to add more data or resolve data that you've collected. So, for example, if you collected an IP address and you wanted to then gather like country and city and business name and that kind of stuff. You can use the enrichment pipeline to actually start to add this information into the interaction, and then the post filter is you can again discard some data if you don't want to process that any further. In terms of performance, so these slides are from the MVP Summit, which was shared with us a few months back. What they found was when you start to throw data at it, as you throw more data at it, it actually does, you will start to get errors, you will start to get losses. But the bottleneck isn't the CPU. The bottleneck is actually SQL Server. So the first slide was 10 DTUs, which is super basic. Going up, this is 50 DTUs and say 100,000 interactions with events at a scale of, what was that? Yeah, 100 a second, 500 a second, and the one at the very back is 1,000 a second. You're not getting any data loss. So the bottleneck really is the database in this instance. The collection is very lightweight. It's just taking some data and a REST API and just putting it into the database. Like I said, you could have used a service bus or something like that, but a database works just as well, and you can scale that very easily if you need to increase for peaks and or if you're expecting more data.
Azure IoT Hub. There are a couple of reasons why we had to pick the Azure IoT Hub. One of the reasons is that we're pushing a ton of information. So the way an RFID reader works is that it's scanning every card, every RFID tag continuously. So like a barcode scanner, if you put it in front of the RFID scanner, it's just, you'll see a ton of information of the same scan again and again. So we used a setting in the reader to ignore a tag for 30 seconds, but you could still scan many tags at one time, and the data was too much that we wanted to be able to send it to an IoT hub, later on look at the data, clean up, and then push it to the universal tracker. The second reason is that the universal tracker expects the flow to be start an interaction, push a bunch of events, and close the interaction. Either you close it or it times out. So for instance, if you take a mobile application and we use a universal tracker for it, you open your app, you use it a bunch of times, close the app, or you walk away and it times out. Great. But in our case, we're scanning people walking through the doors, and we are starting multiple interactions, pushing a bunch of events, and it's quite a bit of information, and we need to sequence it properly if you want to look at it properly, reporting wise and analyzing wise. So we chose the Azure IoT Hub for our storage of whatever comes out immediately from the RFID scanners. So what we did is we chose the default, like we chose a standard tier. Each tier comes with a different limit in terms of data and the messages you can push, as well as how you can scale. For scaling purposes, there's two things you want to scale on. One is how much information can I push, and how much throughput I want to get. So you can use the hub units to decide that. The other one is you could scale on the devices, as in how much you want to read from the Azure IoT Hub. And right now we left it as default, which is 1 and 4. Considering the amount of data, we wanted to load test it just to make sure that we are in the clear. So did we load test it? Absolutely. I wrote a blog post about it. This is one of our load tests. So we're sending about 100,000 messages, so 500 clients with 200 messages sending simultaneously. And we get a throughput of like 292 messages per second, which is pretty decent, because we're not expecting, even if we had this at 4 doors trying to scan people, we only have about 600 to 800 people in the conference. So it's really, there's no way we can scan more than like 300 people at one time. But This would suffice, and it worked out greatly for us. But depending on your application, you might want to scale up or down in order to save money, because Azure ID is a paid service. So that's one of the main reasons why we used Azure ID.
Okay, so we need to obviously send the data from the scanner, and Universal Tracker expects the interaction flow to be in a certain way. So you start an interaction, you pass a bunch of events into it, and then once you're done, you close an interaction, or it times out. So as Akshay mentioned, with our scanners, it's the flow is a bit different because it's one device. Whereas with this kind of thing, we'd either have to individually track every card and then keep a track on what the interaction ID was, whether it's still open or closed, and so on and so forth. So we had to do things slightly differently, because as you've walked through the scanner, it's read the card, we start an interaction, we pass the event, and we close it immediately, and that allows it to be processed a bit more quickly. So with the Universal Tracker, so it is actually very, very simple. To start an interaction, you just make a HTTP put request to /interaction, and you just pass in some information. So you need a channel ID, you need the initiator, you can pass in a user string, which could be useful for identifying different types of browsers, for example, or just different types of devices or whatever you need. You can also pass in a contact alias, a contact identifier. This could be a contact ID, or if you're using identifiers in Sitecore 9, it could be one of the other identifiers, so email address, Twitter handle, whatever your identifier is. And that will allow you to actually start to tie together interactions and the Universal Tracker analytics with your users. So it's then logging against that particular user that you can actually make use of that data with. You can also pass in an array of events. One thing. So you can also pass in an array of events, and when you make this request, it will return an ID. It's a session token. You then need to use this session token, this track and interaction ID, in your further calls as you're making as you're putting more data into the Universal Tracker. You can so the type maps to a .NET type. There's a mapping in the Universal Tracker config, which in turn maps to a .NET type. So you need to use the name of the type from the config here. You can obviously create your own as well if you needed to. The definition ID in this instance is the goal, and the timestamp is now or yesterday or whatever you want to pass in. And that track and interaction ID is the ID from from the first interaction call. And you just make a simple call to a put call to the /event endpoint. You can even do this in Postman for testing purposes initially. As I mentioned, it maps across to .NET types. So goal was the first one. Page view is another type. There's a number of different types out of the box, and they will accept a number of different parameters based on the type itself. So page view will accept a URL. Goal will accept a definition ID, which essentially maps across to the goal ID in Sitecore, the item ID in Sitecore. PageView does accept a bunch more types, but all you're doing is essentially mapping a .NET property type to the JSON format, and you just, if the property name is called URL, for example, the same property in JSON is called URL as well. And then once you're done with sending the data, you just post a call to interaction complete with the interaction ID again, and that will close that interaction. Once the interaction is closed, you can't pass any more data to it. You will have to start a new interaction. And you can also close it, and it will also close by a timeout, and you can define the timeouts per channel as well. There is also an SDK available, which I mentioned earlier. It's a portable class library. You can use it for your Xamarin apps and even your regular .NET apps, and it will be pre-baked into the mobile SDK. It is open source. It's on GitHub. Take a look at that. So you can download the source code for the SDK, and you can you can add references from NuGet as well. There's some fairly good documentation on the SDK itself. The documentation on the Universal Tracker is a little bit lacking at the moment. So in order to push data into Universal Tracker, we scan the cards, we push it into IoT Hub. We have a little app, which then pushes it into Universal Tracker. All it's doing is it's just changing the JSON from one format to the type that Universal Tracker expects, and then off it goes. We did some processing for looking up sessions, so we've based it on time. So as you're coming into a room, we know what the time is, so we know what session is running. It helped that we only did it for one room and not for four, so that would have made things a bit more complicated. We have each card has an ID. It's just a random GUID type thing, which we are then using to essentially identify each person anonymously. And we don't really have much of a demo because you guys are the demo. So as you guys were walking in, we were just scanning and collecting the numbers of the number of groups of people that are walking in. So if you look on your card, you'll have an animal type, and we've essentially just been counting that and pushing that into via the Universal Tracker. We also collect this data, and we've created contacts in our Sitecore instance. So if we go through, you'll be able to see that we have collected a bunch of goals. So the way we'd done this was, as you walked in, we knew what session you were coming in. We started an interaction. We passed in the ID from your card. We then fired off an event, a goal event with the current session ID, and then close the interaction. So that would then register you guys coming in. We also set the avatar facet for each of the contacts. So based on the card, you'll have a different icon. That's about as much information as we have. They're still essentially anonymous contacts. So we know what session you go to, but we just don't know who that person is, right? We also tried to do some reporting, which was, I think I lost a lot of years of my life trying to get this to work. One, it'll speak, and two, they changed a bunch of stuff where it doesn't work. You can see that the goals and the channels were recording some information. I recorded this just about an hour or so before this session. Unfortunately, I forgot to deploy some of the goals, so they didn't quite show up. So the one I did deploy is logging, and you would have seen the other goals logged in the reports. They have collected on the profile. It's just remember when you're doing a deploy of the goals, remember to deploy them. What I did do, which was much more simple, was I hooked it up to Power BI, because that is probably a more realistic way of your users wanting to see the data. There is no reporting with Universal Tracker. It's just collecting data, and maybe there'll be something in the future, but that's a bit of a problem. So I just hooked it up to Power BI, and then we got some stats as to. So we collected the data for just yesterday. We didn't collect any data today, but that gives us some stats of the kind of breakdown of the groups of people that were attending the sessions, how many people attended, what sessions, and what the breakdown of those were in this room. You might notice that the keynote actually has less people than the Sitecore host session, which was immediately afterwards. I'm guessing because there were people coming in a little bit later and a few stragglers and that kind of stuff. But yeah, Power BI is great. So if you need to like hook into reporting, is one of the easiest things was just to actually create a custom view in SQL Server and then have that serve as a basis for the Power BI report, and then it was super simple. There are some things to watch out for if you start to play with this. So all our contacts were anonymous, obviously. So don't forget to enable the anonymous contacts indexing, as they won't show up on the profile. The goals that you saw in the experience analytics, there is a web visit filter, interaction filter. You need to remove that from the Sitecore config on the processing server, because otherwise it will discard all traffic that is not web-based traffic. And of course, Universal Tracker is not web-based traffic. Otherwise, it won't show up on the reports. It'll still collect the data, it just won't show up on the reports. Universal Tracker is very separate from Sitecore, so there is a disconnect between your channels and goals and that kind of stuff. So if you create new channels, you will have to copy that across with configs. The tracking isn't live. It's collecting live, but the processing isn't live. There is a timer. It processes every 5 seconds, and then on top of that, you have each channel has a timeout, and default is 1200 seconds, which is 20-odd minutes. You can't manually kick off the processing. You just need to wait for those timeouts. So if you're playing locally, turn them right down. And the interactions, once you start an interaction, it will give you a GUID. You can't search for an interaction again. So you have to remember what that GUID was, which is why we had to start an interaction, pass in a bunch of events, and then close it immediately. So the system itself, the Universal Tracker itself, it's super flexible. You can push data from anything, anything that can push into a REST endpoint. You can push data from, whether that's mobile devices, JavaScript, IoT devices, or whatever. Bear in mind, it is an initial release, and it is just collection at the moment. There is no personalization by the API. And because it is an initial release, I think some of the things like the reporting are still things that need to be worked on at a future date. And I've left you very little time for context, but that's questions. But that's the end of the talk.
No questions, huh?
Did I did that much of a good job? Or is it because I don't have any goodies? And thanks to all the sponsors. If anybody does have any questions, then yeah, feel free to come and find.
So you have your sensors scanning our badges, and how is exactly that calling tracker to register the events?
So in our sensors, we can configure an endpoint for it to send data to. But it sends it in a very specific format. It's just like, you log into a browser, an admin console, and you can say, send the data to this endpoint. So we're sending it to the Azure IoT endpoint, and then we have another .NET process running, which just takes that data from Azure IoT, the service bus, and just pushes it into the Azure, the Universal Tracker endpoint. And all it's doing is just essentially changing JSON from one format to another. Yeah, this is more of a limitation of the device, but if I had a mobile app, I would obviously send it in the format that it's needed, and I could send it directly to the Universal Tracker endpoint.
Yeah, I have a question. My apology in advance if I have missed this, but so you're tracking visits. So if I enter this room, for example, and then after 5 or 10 minutes I leave this room and enter another one, which visit would count in that case?
So
it'll only count one.
Which one, the first one or?
The first one, because per session it negates like this. So there's custom logic, which is not recording it records your event of you walking in, but it doesn't associate with the session. So we know you went and came back, but only the first one is stored to be sent to the Universal Tracker.
So, okay, yeah. But I guess that this logic could not be considered as the correct one, because actually you might enter in a room by mistake and then go to another session, so the goal isn't met.
So with some of the scanners, you can actually do directional scanning, so it knows when you're coming into a room and it knows when you're leaving a room. We couldn't set it up with this particular scanner, but if you were to go like a bit more fully fledged, then we would look into that kind of stuff. So it would know that you entered the room, and then it would know that you left the room, and then it would know you'd gone into somewhere else, and then it would come back from anywhere somewhere else. So if we had some GPS tracking, that might make it a bit easier as well, but then we'd probably get a few lawsuits.
Okay, thanks.
Does Universal Tracker support distributed caching?
Support what, sorry?
Does it support distributed caching?
Distributed caching.
The caching that spans over multiple servers.
Why would you need distributed caching? For what purpose?
Because, we're collecting so much amount of data, and then SQL Server can't hold that much amount of data. So we need distributed caching so that SQL Server can...
So the way you would do this is you scale your universal, the collection part of the universal tracker, so your collection instance, and you can scale that as much as you want, and each one can have its own database, right? So you could have it in multiple locations, geolocated, and then if you wanted, you could have the processing server you could scale those out if you needed, or you could just have a single processing server that could collect.
And you can throw more DTUs at it. You could segment it by channel.
Yeah.
So you can mitigate it in different ways. But as you can see, the bottleneck is never universal tracker. It's always the database. So to answer your question, you could either raise your DTUs or segment it better by channel wise and have different endpoints. So you can get around it very easily.
Okay.
Yes.
That's good.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone.